go. Thank you, Torin. And I think I'm going to read today from Matthew's Gospel in chapter 23. And starting with the first verse to begin with. And yes, I think so. Yeah. We try to every time. Let me make sure that's going. Well, you know what? Yes, I know that, and it's my fault. For some reason, I didn't turn it on or something. It didn't get the audio a couple of weeks ago. So I thought I was getting it, but Torrin did his part right. It was my fault. Anyway, things happen. Well, now you made me paranoid. I'm going to look and make sure the battery, make sure I got full power. I'm going to clip it on the outside of my jacket so the antenna's not buried. I thought maybe that's what it was. I stuck it in my pocket maybe. Anyway, it's one of those kind of things you don't know what you're going to get till you get home and see if it worked or not. Okay, so Torrin, I'm going to read from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23, and verse 1. And so this weekend is, we celebrate Independence Day, as we've already mentioned. And that's an interesting word, and of course, the holiday, Independence Day, is talking about on the political scene and the national scene and America's independence from Great Britain, to whom we were formerly, not we personally, but the political entity, the United States, was once, as you know, the 13 colonies and now independent. Independence is an interesting word, and in some ways it applies to us as Christians, but then I guess the flip side of that is, in some ways, the word dependence applies to us, and also a related word, interdependence. So I want to talk about those three words and how they relate to us in terms of our Christian life. And first of all, let's just read a little bit from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23. Here Jesus is in the temple with his disciples. And in the temple, of course, the temple is governed by the temple authorities, the scribes and the Pharisees and the temple rulers. And so Jesus, as you know if you've ever read the Gospels, was in constant conflict with them. And here we see this kind of coming to a climactic confrontation. And we're not going to read all of that part, but here he has something to say about them. And in Matthew's Gospel 23, verse 1, it says, "Then spake Jesus unto the multitude and to his disciples," meaning that his disciples were gathered around, plus there was a big crowd as well. So it wasn't just his disciples, but a whole lot of people gathered around to hear him. And here's what he had to say to them. He said, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat." Now he doesn't mean that literally, that Moses had a chair, He just means, figuratively speaking, they stand in Moses' place. And verse 3 says, "All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not." Now I'm sure this really rubbed him the wrong way when he said this. He said, they're standing in the place of Moses, so what they tell you in that role, listen to them, but he points a finger at them and says, don't do what they do, for they, in other words, they talk big. That's how we would say it. They talk big, but their actions don't support what they say. And look at what he says in verse 4, describing their actions, the scribes and the Pharisees. It says, "They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move with one of their fingers." Now he doesn't mean literally. He means spiritually speaking, figuratively speaking. In what they say, they stand up and say things that, in effect, lay heavy burdens on those who listen to them. But they themselves don't make any move to assist or to help. So in other words, they're good at telling you what to do and telling you things that are taxing and hard and, in effect, burdens. But they're unwilling to help at all. Verse 5, "But all their works they do to be seen of men." They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. In other words, they just want they want everyone to admire them. They like the uniforms of their office. They like to be looked up to, and the special garments that they wear, so that people stand in awe of them and respect them. Verse 6 says, they love the uppermost room at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues. They like it when everybody puts them up on a pedestal, we might say, in our way of speaking, treats them as higher than everyone else. That he says they like that. Verse 7, and greetings in the markets, to be called of men, rabbi, rabbi. Of course, in the Jewish faith, rabbi is a teacher and one that's respected. And he says they like that. In other words, to be put up higher than everyone else, telling everyone else what to do, and wearing the marks of their office, and sitting in the best seats, and everyone treating them as though they're higher in status, a higher status than everyone else. But Jesus then speaks to those who are listening to him. And of course, as you can see from what he's saying, he's not going to reiterate or confirm what they're doing. He's suggesting that he's bringing something different. Verse 8, he says to those disciples around him, and by the way, the disciples who are following him, they after he's gone, they will be the people that are in his role, leaders in the church. He says, be ye not called rabbi or teacher. In other words, don't consider yourself of high status, higher than everyone else. For one is your master, even Christ, and you are all brethren. He says, don't be like the scribes and the Pharisees. And he's pretty plain about this. He says, you all have the same status, in other words. And that's the way it is actually supposed to be in the church world. We're not supposed to put ministers on a pedestal. We are all brethren. Ministers, the only difference between a minister and the person sitting in the pews is the minister has more things to do, has an extra task to teach or to do whatever the ministry is. But as far as status, they're no better than or no greater than or deserve no more respect than the ordinary person. He says, you are all brethren. In other words, you're all on the same footing, and we only have one master. In fact, I can tell you that all ministries have the same function. They do different things, and they do it different ways, but all ministers, no matter who they are, have a single function, and that is to point the listener to Christ. You notice here he says, you only have one master, and that's Christ. And all of you are equal. You're all brethren. We're all in the same status. Verse 9, and call no man your father upon earth, for one is your Father, which is in heaven. That doesn't mean, strictly speaking, you can't acknowledge your Father, but he's saying this is the way you should look at it. You're in subjection to God, and human agencies, you are not subject or under them as where spiritual things are concerned. In that sense, there's no human mediator between God and you. Verse 10 says, neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. Verse 11 says, but he that is greatest among you, let him be your servant. And he has something else to say that kind of bears on this, but he said it earlier. If we back up in the story just a little bit, if you could, who's back there? Anton, are you running the computer? Give me chapter 20, Matthew chapter 20 and verse 25. You see, he just before they got to Jerusalem, he gave them a little bit of this same talk, and it kind of bears on what he's saying now. Jesus called them unto him. This is Matthew 20, 25. Jesus called them unto him and said, now this is just before they're getting ready to go into Jerusalem, so he's kind of giving them like a heads up. And he called them unto him and he said, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority over them. Verse 26 says, but it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Verse 28 says, even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered to, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. And what he's pointing out there is still true, and should be true in the church world today. Unfortunately, not always true, but it should be true. The minister is nobody special, not deserving of any special status or no higher than anyone else. He's just like we're all on the same page. We're all in the same status. And by the way, ministers don't know God any better than the ordinary person. We're all the same. So in other words, we've got one God in heaven, and all the rest of us are of the same status. One Jesus that's the leader, and the rest of us are all the same status. And all the ministers are like servants, and their job is to direct our attention to Christ. That's basically what he's saying. Now, one more thing I want to read about this, then I'll make the observation. This is in Hebrews chapter 8, Anton, and I'm going to read from verse 10. Hebrews chapter 8, I'm sorry, verse 11. I told you wrong. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 11. And this is right in the middle of the author of the Hebrews is talking about how the new covenant is superior to the old covenant. And he's quoting from an old covenant prophet named Jeremiah. And we're not going to read the whole thing, but this is one of the things that he's quoting to demonstrate the point he's trying to make. He says, speaking of life under the new covenant that we now live under, he says, they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. That's like saying, that's just another way of saying there's no human intermediary that stands between you and God, because what he's saying here is God's saying, I will have a personal relationship with each and every one of them. You don't go through some human person that stands between. You don't have a person that stands up and says, let me tell you what God is like. I've been up to the mountain and I hear from God. Now I'm going to come back down and tell you what God says. Some people act that way, but that's not right. It shouldn't be that way. He says, he's quoting, the prophet Jeremiah is speaking for God. He says, all shall know me. In other words, every single one of us knows God in exactly the same way. He's no respecter of persons. The same way you hear from God is the same way everybody hears from God. The same uncertainties you have about what God's saying, and let's just be honest, are the same uncertainties everybody has. God doesn't speak to one person in a different way than he speaks to everyone else. They all know me. All know me, from the least to the greatest. Now, the point that these passages we've read today is demonstrating, in one sense, as Christians, we are independent from human agencies, we might say, human beings. We are independent. There's nobody that stands between us and God, who directs your steps and tells you what you should do and tells you what God is saying. Because God says in this new covenant, they'll all know me, from the least to the greatest. So in that sense, we are personally independent from one another. But in another sense, on the flip side of that, what the flip side of that is, we are completely dependent upon Christ and His grace. This is something Apostle Paul talks a lot about, and this is in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, Anton. And I'm giving the short version of these passages. This one especially could be very long if we read the whole thing. But here, let me just give you the background. Paul's writing to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting verse 7. He's writing to them, and he's a little bit upset. We've talked about this before. You can tell when he's reading he's a little bit irritated, because what has evidently happened is this. The Corinthians were his own converts. They listened to his preaching about Christ and believed it, and that was the beginning of the church. But after Paul moved on, he was with them for about a year and a half, the book of Acts says. But then he moved on because his task or his calling or his ministry was to travel throughout the known world and preach about Jesus, not just to stay in one place. So he left, but after he left, evidently some other teachers came preaching something that Paul felt like was contrary or in conflict with what he had said. and stepping in between that direct relationship that he promoted between the Christian and Christ, and sort of stepping in between, making themselves a kind of a superior. You can read between the lines in the previous chapter. He talks about them coming and basically, he talks about them physically slapping them around even. He says, if one shall strike you on the cheek, you'll be submissive to him, and taking their money. He talks about that, and basically living off of them, using the congregation to sort of support a kind of a work-free lifestyle. Just sort of, it must be nice, take up everybody's money and then just run around all week and play golf and, hang out. Must be nice to live that way. And so Paul's writing them saying, I can't believe, you're submitting to this kind of thing. And, he finally feels like he needs to defend himself in his place of his superior understanding of how things really are, to confront these people who have come in and were taking advantage of the Corinthians. And he talks about all the things that he suffered because of his ministry. He talks about being shipwrecked. He talks about being beaten with rods. He talks about being stoned. He talks about, I guess I mentioned shipwreck 3 times. He finally says, he gives this list: in perils of my own countrymen, in perils of the heathen, in perils in the city, perils in the wilderness. And then he talks about, and above all that, my concern, my anxiety about all the churches. And he says, now these things constitute, he says, my infirmities. And he said, and then he finally comes to telling about his revelations. He talks about how he was caught up into the third heaven and heard great revelations and things that are hard to express and difficult to put into words. And then it says in verse 7, here's where we are now. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. He says, and lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me, he's talking about himself now, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Now sometimes casual readers and some Christians who don't really put on their thinking caps and are not really thinking through the implications of what they say, sometimes Christians say, well, God gave him a thorn in the flesh. No, God did not give him a thorn in the flesh. In fact, it says right here in the text, it says, a messenger of Satan. Now, when I read a messenger of Satan, that makes me think not God, but Satan. They're not the same, Everybody understands Satan and God not the same? And do you also understand that Satan does not work for God? Does everybody understand that? Satan is called the adversary. That means he's the opponent. God does not sit up in heaven and say, hey, Satan, I got a job for you. I want you to go buffet Paul in the flesh, lest he get a big head and be exalted above measure. No, here, let me explain what he's saying. God gave him revelations because God wanted him to go and tell people and reveal to them what Jesus had done in the new covenant. And because he had these great revelations, Satan looked and said, I can't let this guy Paul go tell them all this, because if they find out all this, their lives are going to be free. They're going to be happy. They're going to be full of joy. And I got to stop this, Paul. And so Satan sends trouble to Paul to buffet him. Buffet means you know what buffet means. Like if you're outside in a big windstorm and you're trying to drive home and the winds are on every side, your car is blowing all over the road. That's what buffet means. In fact, as a matter of fact, exactly like what he already described in the previous chapter when he talked about all the shipwrecks and the stonings and the beating with rods. What he's saying here is, because I had these great revelations from God to share with you and with everybody else, Satan attacked me with all of these things to buffet me. He's saying, I see that that's what's happening now. You see, he has great revelations. He's seen things the rest of us maybe have not seen. So it says in verse 8, he did the logical thing. He said in verse 8, For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. So he's saying, I went to God and I prayed, and he said, you know, this messenger of Satan is buffeting me. And I guess he could have laid out in his prayer all these different things that he mentioned about the shipwrecks and the beatings and all of that. And he said, I besought the Lord thrice. And I understand that. That's kind of what we would do. But look at what he says here in verse 9. This is interesting. And he said to me, that is the Lord, he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. That is to say, your weakness, Paul. Now, before we go on reading, let's acknowledge the fact that none of us have experienced the kind of trouble that Paul experienced. Let's acknowledge that I'm looking around the room here. I don't think any of you have ever been beaten with rods or been in a shipwreck. Am I right? 3 times. I don't think you've ever had people throw rocks at you and try to kill you. Am I right? I don't think you've ever had to be lowered down over the wall of a city so that the authorities wouldn't capture you. All these humiliating things happened to the Apostle Paul. Yet we have things that are enough trouble for us. We have our own difficulties. We don't have what Paul experienced. And let's also acknowledge that what Paul experienced is far greater, both in number and in degree and in every way, than the things that we experience. But nevertheless, the things we experience as trouble are troubling to us. So the same thing is true where we are concerned. What Paul said he got from his prayer about this is this remark from Jesus, who told him, my grace is sufficient. That means it's good enough, or it's enough to meet the need. Now, what is his grace? Well, his grace is his unmerited favor, his love and his favor towards you, which is solely because of his nature of love. It's not something you paid for. It's not something you earned. It's not something tied to your merits. It's his grace, his gracious favor on your behalf. And what he said to Paul is, my grace is enough for you. For my strength is made perfect in your weakness. I added the word your, just so you make sure you understand. So in situations where you feel powerless, or feel weak, or feel unable to affect the outcome that you'd like to see, what we have to come to is the realization that we are dependent on his grace, just like Paul said here. And we can adopt the same attitude. In fact, you know why Paul's writing this is he wants to give us that perspective on it. He says, most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So what he's saying is, I realize now that the areas where I'm weak and powerless and unable to affect what I want, these are the places where I've got to trust in Christ. And he says, I look at it this way. Here's my new perspective, he's saying. I look at it this way now. When I can't do anything about it, I have to depend on him. Now his power can rest upon me. Verse 10 says, therefore I take pleasure in infirmities. Well, this is kind of a hard pill to take, you know. I mean, I don't think the rest of us could maybe say that with Paul, but he's saying this is my attitude about it. In contrast, reproaches, necessities, persecutions. See, you see when he says reproaches, necessities, persecutions, this is how you know that when he described his quote, quote, thorn in the flesh, that he was talking about all those things he mentioned earlier. Distresses for Christ's sake, for when I'm weak, then I'm strong. In other words, when I see that I can't do anything. Now, see, this is an attitude of dependence. Now, taking it together with what we read from Jesus and also from the book of Hebrews, we don't have some minister over us or some preacher or some apostle or some prophet or some human standing between us and God. We have a direct relationship with God himself. He said, they all know me, from the least to the greatest. And the same thing that's true for Paul is true for all of us. His grace is sufficient for all of us. In areas where we're weak, he can rest his strength upon us. And like Paul says, when I'm weak, then am I strong. That is to say, when I can't do it, I recognize that His strength can rest upon me. He's saying, I adopt an attitude of dependence upon Him, and I'm just saying, here I am, I'm dependent upon you. And Paul's recommending that we have the same attitude. Now, he says something very similar, and I like comparing places. Anton, this is Romans chapter 8, and I'm going to start with verse 35. I like places where he says things that are similar but using different language because it helps us get a greater depth on the attitude that he's getting across here. In verse 35, he says, this is in chapter 8, and in chapter 8 he's summing up his message of the gospel. Now he's got some more to say in this letter to the Romans, but in chapter 8 he's summing up his presentation of what he considers to be the message of good news, the message of the gospel. It takes him 8 chapters, and it's in great detail to get it across. And it's all about the grace of God, and it's all about our faith and how we're placed into a relationship of favor with God. He calls it righteousness, which is perfect favor with God. He describes it in great detail, all the different aspects of it. And now he's trying to sum it up here. And he says in verse 35, in summing this up, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Now this is the same thing he was talking about with the Corinthians, where he was talking about all the things that came against him, all the things that attacked him, all the things that buffeted him, all the things that made him weak. And now he's saying, here's the way I look at it. Here's what I say. Who can separate us from the love of Christ? In other words, who can get between you and His love for you? And then he says, shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Those are all the things he mentioned back there in 2 Corinthians. Remember when he said, my grace is sufficient? Distress, persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, or sword. Now, let's be honest and say that I think most of us have not experienced persecution, famine, nakedness, peril, or sword. But then when he said tribulation, that just means pressure. There's where we all can identify with him. And it makes, by comparison, our pressures seem relatively small, but nevertheless, not to minimize, our pressures are significant to us, but the same thing is true. What can separate you from the love of Christ? The difficulties that come against you? No. The answer is, see, he says in verse 36, Anton, if you give me that one, when he says this in verse 36, as it is written, for thy sake we are killed all the day long, we are accounted sheep for the slaughter. We even use that expression today. That's a common euphemism. People say that today. I feel like sheep being led to the slaughter. That means without any defense, defenseless is what that means. So he's quoting an Old Testament passage and he's saying in effect, you might feel like this is how it is. This might be how you feel. I'm defenseless, like sheep to the slaughter. But look at the next verse, verse 37. This is King James translation. Nay. Now, that's not a word we use every day. Nay. It's not horse talk. That's spelled a different way. Nay means no. No means what I just said about being defenseless and like sheep to the slaughter. He's saying, no, it's not like that. In other words, you might feel that way and it might seem that way, and a person might be tempted to think that way, but he says, no. No. Now listen, in all these things, what things? Well, all those things he described that represented our weakness or our trouble or persecution, all those things he mentioned. Now, we don't have that, persecution and nakedness and sword and all that. He had that. He experienced all those things. But we have our own trouble. But he's saying in all those things, in the trouble or the pressure that we face, because nothing can separate us from the love of Christ, in all those things we are more than conquerors. Not because we're strong, not because we're super duper, not because we prayed all night long, not because we fasted for 2 weeks, not because we did anything, but purely because of Him that loved us. That's Christ, by the way. Now here's something you don't get from reading an English translation. This was originally written in the Greek language, and the oldest manuscripts we have are in the Greek language. That was, in the 1st century, the language of intellectual discourse. And so the texts are written in Greek. We don't speak Greek, we speak English, so somebody's got to translate it. But sometimes some things that are said in the Greek language don't necessarily come across to us. So for instance, here's one of those. And let me just take for a minute to explain it, because I think it's really good once you see it. When he says, in all those things, and remember, all those things mean all the trouble that comes against us. In all those things, he says, we are more than conquerors. Now, that expression, more than conquerors, in the Greek language, it's actually a single word. It's a compound word in the Greek language. More than conquerors. In the Greek language, the core word is nikeo, and it comes from the root word Nike. Now you might have heard of Nike before. It's a kind of sneakers, isn't it? You ever heard of those? Nike. And you know why they put that word on those sneakers? Because the word actually means victory. So when a person's wearing Nike sneakers, he's wearing victory sneakers. That's why they put that on those shoes. Because the word Nike, or Nike, means victory. And the Greek word that's used here, that part of the word is that word, victory. And you can see here the word conquer. That's a version of that. But there's also a word attached to that word Nike, or victory. And in the Greek language, it's spelled H-U-P-E-R, hooper. It's a prefix. And it's exactly like our English prefix hyper. Now we use that, we know what that means. Hyper means like to an extreme, right? Like in a science fiction film, if they're in the spaceship and they put it in hyperdrive, it means suddenly they go real, real fast, right? Or if, sometimes we say that little child had too much candy, he's hyper. That means he's got, way too much energy. It means above and beyond, right? That's what hyper means. We know that that's what that means, and that's what it means in the Greek language too. So what this more than conquerors literally means, it's a word hyper nikeo, hyper victory. He didn't just say victory, he said above and beyond, infinitely above and beyond victory. Victory is one thing, but above and beyond, superlative, way above. He says, in all these things we are superlative, way and above victory because of him that loved us. Not just victory, but infinitely above victory. I heard one person explain it this way, that in the boxing ring, the heavyweight champion, big tough guy, I don't know who it is nowadays. I think Mike Tyson used to be. Didn't he used to be the heavyweight champion one time? Mike Tyson, he's a big tough guy, You wouldn't want to get in a fight with him. Just those guys, leave him alone, I wouldn't want to get in a fight with Mike Tyson. You know why? Because he's pretty strong, right? Pretty tough. So the big tough guy gets in the ring, and he's really strong, and he defeats the opponent, and now he's got the victory. But then, when they write him a check for his conquering, he's a conqueror. He gets the check, but he takes it home and gives the check to his wife, and now she's more than a conqueror. You know why? Because she didn't have to get in the ring and fight. But she's got all the rewards from the fight. You get it? That's why he says, through him that loved us, we are more than conquerors. In other words, all these things that we face, he's trying to remind us, it's not just you standing there facing things. You've got somebody on your side who is like a heavyweight champion of the universe. He's more than a conqueror. He's a conqueror, and he makes you more than a conqueror. He says, in all these things we are hyper nikeo. We are above and beyond victory. Now, why is he writing this, by the way? See, this is clearly the way Paul views it. He's writing this so that we, as the readers, will adopt the same attitude that he has. In fact, if you read the next verse, Anton, verse 38, he says, I am persuaded. Now, the reason he writes that is he wants to persuade all of us, too. I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come. He's just about drawing a big circle around everything, right? But wait, he's not done. Verse 39, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. He's writing all this so that we would come to see things the way he sees things. That no matter what you face, no matter what your difficulties are, they're not the same as Paul, but he's saying, look at me and my difficulties. In all these things, I'm persuaded that none of this can separate me from the love of God. In fact, I'm persuaded that I come out hyper-Nikkei. I come out above and beyond. I come out victorious because somebody's on my side. Somebody's fighting on my behalf. In fact, that's how he got this little discussion started. Anton, if you would, just back up to verse 31 just for a second. This is how he got this little discussion started. What should we say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? Well, that's a rhetorical question. He doesn't mean that there's any doubt. He could have just as easily said, because God is for us, nothing can be against us. Now, that's not just Paul, and that's not just some special elite few. That's everybody. That's everybody that's a Christian. Remember what we read? All shall know me, from the least to the greatest. So, on the one hand, we are independent in the sense that no human being stands over us and is in between us. In fact, he just says here, nothing can come between us and the love of Christ. But on the other hand, we're completely dependent upon Christ and His grace. But that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's dependable, because it's worth depending on. Now, let's talk about one more thing before we finish, and that's in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. Not only are we independent in one sense, and not only are we dependent upon Christ and His grace in another sense, but we're also, in a yet third sense, interdependent. And here's where Paul brings this up. I like the way he says it here in Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. He says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the love of Christ. Bear ye one another's burdens. Now, as it relates to our interrelationship with one another, we are, what our interactions with one another are governed by is the love of Christ. The same love that He has for us, that governs our interactions with one another. So he gives this instruction. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the love of Christ. Now, sometimes you're the person who is under the weight of the pressure, and you need someone to help bear your burden. Sometimes you see someone else, and you have an opportunity, and when you do, you're able to help them with theirs. And a good illustration of how this, a good practical illustration of how this plays out is found in Luke's Gospel, chapter 10. And we're going to read that to end with. This is Luke's Gospel, chapter 10. I'm going to start, Anton, with verse 23. And Jesus is here talking to the scribes and the Pharisees, and they're trying to find fault with Him. Let's see if am I in the right chapter here? Maybe I got the wrong, hold on, let me just make sure I got the right thing here. Yeah, chapter 10, verse 23. Yeah, that's what I wanted. So he's talking to his disciples here, and he says to them, to his disciples, talking about the things that he has been preaching and revealing to them and showing them. And he said to his disciples, he said this is privately. So this is not out in the temple, this is privately. He says, blessed are the eyes which see the things that you see. Now, he doesn't just mean what you're visually looking at. He's saying to understand what you're understanding, that I'm showing you, helping you understand. I'm giving you a perspective, he says. Look at verse 24. For I tell you that many prophets and kings have desired to see the things that you see. He means to understand, and have not seen them, and to hear the things that you hear and have not heard them. That's really awesome, isn't it? He's here revealing things that great kings and prophets in the past wanted to look into, but it was hidden from them. It was a mystery. And then verse 25 says, behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him. Now, when it says that, we know right away this is an insincere question. He's not asking this in a sincere way. It says he's trying to trip him up or put him in in a rhetorical bind, sort of find fault with him. It says he tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Now, we understand that he's asking this not because he really wants to know, but because he is tempting him. So it's an insincere question, but nevertheless, Jesus answers him. It's very clever the way Jesus answers him. He refers him back to, you see, the reason they were trying to tempt him is they thought he was coming to disrupt what they thought was their, what they lived by, the law. And he was coming to bring something new, that's true. But as he said in another place, I haven't come to destroy but to fulfill. But they weren't willing to listen to him, and so he's asking an insincere question. So he turns him to the law that he is trusting in. He says, what's written in the law? How do you read? And he says in verse 27, answering, saying, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Verse 28, and he said to him, thou hast answered right, this do, and thou shalt live. In other words, there's your answer, now go on, He's just kind of shutting down the conversation. If he wanted to know more, he would come and be more sincere and open. And he might hear some of the things that he's telling his disciples that prophets and kings wanted to look into. But he says, all right, you got your answer. There you go. But let's look at verse 29, next verse. But he wasn't satisfied with that. He willing to justify himself. You know what that tells me? When Jesus said, you've answered rightly, just do this, and then you'll have what's promised. That somehow that condemned him, because evidently he felt that he was not doing that. You see, that's the way the law works. It's given so that every mouth might be stopped and all the world become guilty before God. And it says this man was willing to justify himself. So he wanted to make excuses for himself. In other words, in his heart, he felt like he had not complied, so he wants to make excuses. That's what justify himself means. So he said to Jesus, who's my neighbor? In other words, I haven't, maybe I haven't lived up to this, but it's because I don't know who my neighbor is. Who's my neighbor? Like Mr. Rogers. Well, Mr. Rogers knew. It's him, right? Won't you be my neighbor? I trust you've all seen Mr. Rogers, Now, I guess if you're young enough, you might not have seen him. Anyway, why are we talking about Mr.? Oh, yeah, the neighbor. Now I got that on my mind. I just can't get that out of my mind here. Okay, so Jesus is going to answer his question. And he says in verse 30, a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Verse 31, and by chance there came down a certain priest that way. Now, priests are persons of course, high status in the Jewish religion. Priest is not just some nobody, he's a person of high status. You would hope, a person that would know what it's all about, where God is concerned. So it said, Jesus said, a certain priest came that way. And when he saw him, he passed on the other side. And verse 32, likewise a Levite. The Levites were especially charged with ministry inside the temple and the music and a lot of the service in the temple. Again, a person of high status in the Jewish religion. The Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him and passed on the other side. Verse 33, but a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed. Now, you remember last week we talked in great detail about the Samaritans, why there was such hostility to the Samaritans. And they were looked down upon, and they were considered heretics because of their religious practices. And for various reasons, they were considered half-breeds because they had intermingled with the people of the land. And the Jews looked down on them, and there was hostility and hatred, really, prejudice against the Samaritans. So to this lawyer who is asking this question, when Jesus said a Samaritan, this would be a person that he would ordinarily look down upon. A certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw him, he had compassion on him. So before we get to the end of this, let's just take a couple of notes. When the question was, who is my neighbor? The first thing is that compassion is the first component. Verse 33 says, that's verse 33. Verse 34 says, he went to him, bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave, it was cheaper to stay at the hotel in those days. Yeah, I guarantee you can't take out 2 pence and pay for a room now. On the morrow he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said to him, take care of him, and whatever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. And before we go on, you could say, some people have, and I think it's right, that this Good Samaritan, this is, in one way, you could say this is a figure of Jesus. Jesus came to a wounded humanity and carried our burdens, and at his own expense brought us to a place of healing and recovery. But the only reason we can say that is because we recognize in the life of Christ the perfect example of what it means to love, what it means to have an attitude of love. He had compassion, it said. But see, what Jesus is doing is he's recommending the same attitude to his listeners. Verse 36, he sums it up. It says, "Which now of these three thinkest thou was a neighbor to him who fell among thieves?" Well, this is kind of a rhetorical question because the answer is obvious. Verse 37, he said, "He that showed mercy." You see, I pointed out to you that Jesus in the story said that the Samaritan had compassion upon him. He that showed mercy. And then Jesus said to him, "Go and do thou likewise." Now, when Paul said back in Galatians that we read earlier, "Bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the love of Christ," see, the question might arise in our minds, just like this lawyer. Well, how am I supposed to do that? How do I know to do it? Well, have an attitude of mercy. Have an attitude of compassion. And when your path crosses with someone, see, Jesus just presented a kind of what we would call a coincidence, just a crossing of paths. It was just, you might say, coincidence that the Samaritan passed by that way. So in our lives, when coincidence, or you might say God, if you want to look at it that way, when someone crosses our path, have an attitude of mercy. Be open to having compassion. And as you're able, as you can, be helpful, be kind, be loving. Bear the burden as you're able to, you see. And it's very simple, and that's what he said. It's about mercy, and it's about compassion. And so in that sense, we are in a relationship of interdependence. So in one sense, we're independent because we each individually relate to God on our own. There's no human intermediary. But in another sense, we're completely dependent upon the grace of God. But it's dependable, so it's nothing to be worried about. And in yet a third sense, we are interdependent because we show compassion and love and kindness. And that's really all it is: compassion, love, mercy, and kindness. And if you have that kind of attitude, that's what Jesus says we're supposed to do. Okay, that's all we got today.